Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I have a very special guest on, and his name is Ben Watkins. Now, I brought him on here today because I really respect him. He's a part of the Real Atheology podcast, and he's very philosophically minded as well. He's a very philosophically minded atheist. He's not the type of new atheist. He respects our position better than other atheists do, so that's why I brought him on here today to kind of have a little dialogue and discussion about this sort of thing. So Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Ben Watkins, and I'm in Norfolk, Virginia. And I'm the host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from an atheist perspective. And so one of our goals is to try to understand what the concept of religion can look like once we've already rejected theism, and to see if there's anything salvageable in what our future forms of life as far as religion could possibly look like.
All right, thanks, Ben. So I wanted to have a little discussion about this book, and the main reason why is he actually brings in what's called the Theoretic Virtues, right? And I actually agree with him that that's probably the best way we want to approach arguments for and against God. So typically what you see, at least among like apologists, is you'll have a bunch of arguments, right, with premises, and then you'll have people argue and debate about those arguments. Well, I think a better approach, I think for both of us, both the theist and the atheist, is to take an approach that he takes, which is looking at theism and naturalism from these theoretic virtues, right? And I think that can be helpful because it's what really tells, okay, which hypothesis is better. So, arguments, I think they're helpful, right? But they can only go so far, right? And I think once we look at theism and naturalism with these theoretic virtues, then that can really help to figure out which theory is better, right? Now, I guess we can start off there and then kind of move on to our principle. So, the first theoretic virtue would be simplicity, which is that you want to have a theory that's simple, right? So it can't posit, like it has to have I would say the fewest amount of entities within the theory, right? And you also want to have explanatory power, which is your theory wants to explain reality, right? So you don't just want a simple theory, but you also want a theory that can kind of make sense of the world, right? And then also there's explanatory scope, which is that your theory must account for all the data, and then also predictability, that your theory must be able to make some sort of future prediction, or maybe there's some phenomena that we see now that a theory would predict, right? So I guess to start off, Ben, so from your perspective, what's your perspective on the naturalistic hypothesis, that you think obviously that it's more simple and that it has the same amount of explanatory power? What's your perspective on that, just to kind of start off the conversation?
Sure. So I think the question that's really important to get into focus is really just the well-worn question of, does God exist? And so what we're trying to do, instead of arguing, giving particular arguments to this, we're recognizing that there's two mutually exclusive options to this question. And so those two mutually exclusive options have, we can say, morphed into this naturalism on one side and the theistic version on the other, where the naturalistic hypothesis is basically saying that, look, physical facts are fundamental, or that material is somehow fundamental. Whereas the theistic hypothesis is saying that no, somehow mind is fundamental, ontologically fundamental, that the mental world explains why there's a physical world at all. And again, the naturalist view is, no, why there's a mental world at all is explained by a physical world. Those are very rough ways of looking at naturalism and theism. And so to get it more precise, to pin it down more, the theistic hypothesis could be something like perfect being theism. And the naturalistic hypothesis could be something like metaphysical naturalism, which maintains that the universe is causally closed in some sense. And so then we can start asking ourselves about theoretical virtues here. And so the ones that you mentioned, I think is a great place to start, because how I've normally cut this up is I've thought about this in Kantian terms. So I've thought about explanatory power, or so it's a posteriori theoretical virtues, and then a priori theoretical virtues, things like simplicity, which we can then chop up into further concepts, things like coherence or simplicity, or no, I'm sorry, coherence or modesty. And so the way I see it as far as naturalism goes, is that naturalism is more coherent and more modest than theism. And so now this is where our conversation, I hope, is going to get pretty interesting, because your view is an idealistic one, whereas this theistic hypothesis is often considered to be dualistic. And so that might be an area in which your form of Christian theism has a theoretical virtue that theism wouldn't normally have. Seeing as how theism would posit a natural world plus a supernatural world, whereas naturalism is there's just the one natural world. There's just one, but maybe an idealist view also shares that same theoretical virtue. And then the idea of coherence is just the idea that the parts of a hypothesis fit together better. So on naturalism, there's problems with internal coherence in things like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, or something like the hard problem of consciousness. How do you fit first-person subjective points of view into a third-person world? Whereas theism has internal coherence issues in the sense of, how is the concept of God even one that's coherent? Something like, maybe if we're thinking about a perfect being, we would think that such a being is perfectly just and perfectly merciful. Well, perfect justice means giving everyone exactly what they deserve, and perfect mercy is giving everyone less than what they deserve. So this seems like a logical tension, an a priori tension. How can we have this thing, perfect mercy and perfect justice? And so there might be solutions to all of these problems. I'll go ahead and concede that readily. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when we're looking at the theoretical virtue of coherence, what we're looking for is how the pieces fit together. The harder it is to fit the pieces of a hypothesis together, the more that counts a priori against that hypothesis. And so I would insist that naturalism is more coherent than theism. But that's certainly a point of disagreement.
Right. So yeah, I think you made a lot of good points. Now, of course, I wouldn't agree with the last part you said there, but I mean, there's a lot of things you said in there that I would agree with, right? So you mentioned how my form of theism doesn't make this natural supernatural distinction, which, I mean, that is true, right? Because I don't posit, at least under idealism, under theistic idealism, I don't have to posit some like supernatural reality that's beyond nature, right? So I guess that's a point that we can actually agree on, right? That all that really exists is nature, right? Now, of course, your interpretation, or at least your view of nature, is that this nature is physical, right? Whereas I think that all of nature is mental in type, right? So, I mean, obviously, yes, there's differences there, but in terms of just simplicity, right? I think that's where we can have agreement on, which is that at least your view and my view seem to share that same idea, where there's only one causal reality. In fact, Graham Oppie, he kind of pointed this out, not the kind of view I hold to, but he did mention how when we're comparing two views about global causal reality, one view, the naturalist view, is that global causal reality includes two different types, which is natural causal entities, and then the natural non-physical causal entities. So his definition of natural is actually very loose, because it actually allows these sort of like physical entities. So, he calls them souls, but and then, of course, he says later that he says, as the theistic view has commitments that the naturalist view has, but then it adds on to, this, extra ontological category, we would call it supernatural, right? So, I mean, I agree with Oppie, and I would also agree with you that I think having that distinction between natural and supernatural is not very helpful, right? And I think the real discussion then should be, okay, well, can we agree that there's one global causal reality, like everything has at least one ontology, right? Everything has, this causal structure to it. Now, I also want to clarify, for my sake and also for Tim's sake, that I would actually say that the ground for reality is something that's supreme, something that's perfect. Right now, of course, you're not going to agree with that, but that's another point I want to point out, that I guess under our views, we would hold to this ground for reality. But then, of course, we disagree about what that ground is, right? But again, in terms of simplicity, they would be equally simple in that sense. Tim, is there anything you want to add to that, or?
The only thing I'd say is, I'm more attracted to kind of an ontological monism as well. So that's partly why I am idealist, like Kyle is. And so thinking about these things coming from that point, I think that will be kind of a strength within the conversation for all three of us.
And I guess one final thing I also want to mention is Philip Leon, he has a principle, not a principle, but it's an argument from material causality, and that basically it says that every cause that we ever see is material. Now, under my position, I wouldn't actually disagree with that, right? I would just say that material cause is mental in type. Right. So when we talk about matter, what matter is, I just say that matter is just the extrinsic appearance of mental things or God's thoughts or whatever. But I mean, again, I would agree with his principle, because that is true, that yes, we both accept this idea, at least, that all we see are kind of these causes and effects. Right. And so I think that's a really good kind of agreement there. So. Is there anything else you want to add, and then we'll go to the next topic?
I think that's pretty. I feel like we resolved any disagreements we might have had there. So
You're right. I guess yes, yeah. So I guess the only thing that I think we would have disagreements about, right, would be this idea of a supreme foundation, right? This thing that can, be the supreme ground, not just supreme, but like this thing, would be God, because it has supreme value. And so because it has supreme value, then it would entail, at least by that it has supreme power, supreme knowledge, right? Those sort of things. So yeah, I guess that's the next kind of discussion. Now, I just want to ask Ben for clarification. So under your hypothesis, so when you talk about, let's say, grounding morality, or grounding, let's say, reason or mathematics, right? Under the naturalistic hypothesis, let me just ask, would you say that those sort of things are kind of like brute necessities, that they're just kind of part of nature? Or would you kind of go a different route? What's your perspective on kind of how would a naturalist explain these things? Do they explain them by brute necessities, right? I guess fine-tuning, for example, like those things are just brute necessities, or would you go a different route? What's your perspective on that?
So different naturalists will undoubtedly give different answers, as these are pretty deep philosophical issues. So I can certainly lay out where my sympathies lay. So my sympathies lay in the language of modal semantics. So I would say that truths about mathematics or logic or morality or just normativity in general are the kinds of truths that don't require any further explanation because of their abstractness. So in this sense, they would be necessary truths. They would be the types of truths that would be true in all possible worlds. This is to contrast this with like a contingent truth, which would be true in only some possible worlds. So to give an example, it might be a contingent truth that if you yank a cat's tail, it will cause it to experience pain. But that's a contingent truth. We might be able to pull a cat's tail and it cause it a jolt of pleasure. And so when we're thinking about the property of wrongness, which would be a necessary type of property, we would then say that there's a necessary truth, that it's wrong to cause another sentient creature unnecessary pain. That's going to be the same across all those possible worlds. And it's what makes it the case that in the one possible world where yanking a cat's tail hurts it, it's wrong to yank a cat's tail in that world. But the world where pulling a cat's tail causes a jolt of pleasure, it's not wrong in that world. So this is what's often called the necessary supervenience thesis. So basically it's saying that if any, you can't have a change in moral properties without having some change in non-moral properties. So what on earth does that mean? So the best illustration I found of it is to think of the Holocaust. So we would all agree that the Holocaust has the property of being wrong. Well, this necessary supervenience thesis says that every possible world in which the Holocaust obtains, it is also wrong in that world for the Holocaust to have happened. There is no world in which it's identical to our world in all of its non-moral respects, but in which the Holocaust was morally permissible or even morally right. And so I think that's a pretty powerful line of thought for this idea of necessary truths. I think this idea of metaphysical necessity can apply across the domains of mathematics and logic and morality and normativity. And so I don't even know, especially for something like morality, I just don't even use the term brute. I don't even, sometimes it's one of those terms like naturalism or idealism that can be kind of fuzzy. And, what exactly do we mean by a brute fact, and how exactly is bruteness an objection to something? You know what I mean?
Right.
These are all questions that have to be settled by even introducing the concept. So I just don't introduce the concept, so I don't have to settle those issues.
Right.
So in a way, it might be cheating.
Okay. Well, I actually appreciate that, because I would actually agree that those sort of things are sort of necessary truths, right?
I was going to agree with that too.
So,
yeah,
I mean, in that
sure.
sense, I mean, I don't know too much about your moral theory, but I mean, if that's kind of the basic idea behind it, that these things are kind of like necessary truths, I don't really see a disagreement there, right? And I think this goes, I guess we can kind of move on to the PSU, because this is where me and Tim would kind of, I guess, introduce this whole idea of simple unification. So let me first clarify what I mean by that. So I guess to start off, the principle says, basically, going off the top of my head, that for any set of things, whether contingent or necessary, so this includes necessary facts, there is a simple root that kind of unifies those facts. So let's just take morality, or let's say fine-tuning, for example. Like those things they're like necessary truths about the world, right? But they're unified by something deeper, by something that has a sort of moral nature, and also has sort of the intentions to like fine-tune the universe or whatever. And this applies all across the board. So not just those examples, but also mathematics, right? Reason itself has the same root. So yes, reason is a necessary truth in the sense that like they're true in all possible worlds, but at the same time, all these sort of necessary truths, they're not like, they're not isolated from each other, right? They're kind of unified by something more simple in reality. And I guess this goes into the idea that we want to prefer a theory that has a sort of like simple root. So like, let's just take scientific explanations, for example. So physicists are to this day still trying to figure out how are we going to combine all the laws of physics into one sort of law, or like one sort of equation or, whatever, and then use this equation that entails the laws or entails the other things, right? So we see this in science as well. And we also see it on a practical level as well. So like, for example, if you're in a house and there's water, coming from the faucet, going into the bathtub, from the sink, whatever, or the toilet or whatever, right? So you have water that's in the house, but then it all came from the same source, right? Which is the water system, right? So, I mean, of course, that's a practical way to think about it. But I mean, I guess it highlights the point that I would say that another theoretic virtue that's important, in fact, I would say this is probably the most important theoretic virtue, would be simple unification. Basically, that you need a theory that starts off with one simple thing, right? And then that entails the sort of other things within the hypothesis. So Ben, what do you think about that idea of a simple unification?
So I'm certainly sympathetic with it. I will go ahead and mention at the outset that this is certainly an assumption that we might share, but it's certainly controversial. So there are people that push back on this idea that we should be looking for something simple, because that the simplicity that we find in our theories might just be something that's an aesthetic preference that isn't actually a guide to truth. Now, I'm not saying that I find those arguments persuading, but I am saying it's an assumption that we've made. It's a substantive point that can be disagreed with, and certainly people are going to push back on it. But putting that worry to the side, I am sympathetic to this because my thought has taken somewhat of a Hegelian turn in the past year or two. So to help everyone with the jargon, there's a very famous divide in philosophy called the analytic divide and the synthetic. Yeah. I'm thinking of Kant. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, it's okay.
There's an analytic tradition of philosophy, and there's a continental tradition of philosophy. And so my training is mainly in the analytic tradition of philosophy. So what they're going to be focusing a lot on are going to be precision in concept, clarity of language, rigor of argument. So it's going to feel like math. It's going to feel like logic.
Yeah.
Whereas there's this continental tradition that instead focuses more on experience and emotion and how the complexities of everyday life play out. So philosophy in this tradition is going to look more like theater or literature. And so Hegel is one of the post-Kantians. He's one of the what's known as the German idealists. And he's seen as kind of the start of this continental tradition. So that's where, I was in trying to dive into this continental tradition. I was like, well, why don't I just start with Hegel? And I've never left. So
Yeah.
My thought has taken this Hegelian turn in that Hegel sees the world as this one unified rational whole. His view is very holistic. And so he sees us as part of the world. So the view is very monistic, as we were talking about earlier, a monistic ontology. Because he wants to say that no, look, we're part of the world. We're aspects of the world. So there isn't this radical division that Kant gave us in that there's, these perceiving subjects and then the world out there. No, our minds divide up the world into subject and object. And there has to be a reunification of this. If our concept is going to understand the world in terms of us as perceiving subjects and the world as objects that impose themselves on us as subjects. If we're going to try to understand the world just in carving it out like that, we have to reunify subject and object. So the classical philosophical division is between metaphysics and epistemology. And so what Hegel is going to want to do is unify these two things, knowing and being, metaphysics and epistemology. He wants those to be one thing so that we have this simple, holistic view of the world that includes ourselves in it as part of that very world. That is also an autonomous being that can have knowledge and can affect the world and can develop in certain ways. And so I'm very sympathetic to this Hegelian view these days. Who knows? Maybe I might grow out of this. This might be a phase, and in 5 years, I'll look back and be like, man, what was I doing? But it's something that I very much, especially in my work in the philosophy of religion, it gives us very unique perspectives in the philosophy of religion, perspectives that I don't even think the new atheists would even bother entertaining, much less getting excited about or even exploring.
I had a couple thoughts. Were you done?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, just before I forget them, because there's just so many things going on. Yeah, so I love what I was hearing, because I'm thinking about, okay, when you're talking about, well, we're a part of the world, for example, I'm thinking about, okay, what are all the things, we look at all the things that are instantiated, and these are facts about reality, facts about the world. And then these, I guess, compose a set of facts about reality and things. And so going back to what was helpful in my thinking when Kyle and I were both talking about unification, because the emphasis is on the unification. Simplicity is definitely there, but it's like we have a set of facts about the world and all the different things instantiated, and that would include us and the relevant different things. A part of that, how many of those facts are, doesn't really matter. We can call it like a set of facts Y, for example. And then it's like, then there's like a unifying fact X, in which unifies the set of facts Y. And that's basically like that's basically the kind of the grounding for our basic thinking. There's a set of facts, there's a fact X that unifies a set of facts Y. And so of course the simplicity follows, but the main thing about the unification and the unification of the things that are instantiated, things are a part of the world and whatnot. And so that's basically kind of the whole lay of the land and the kind of groundwork for wanting to opt in for seeing unification as a theoretical virtue, in the sense of when we're talking about theory choice or how to think about the world and things like that. We see different areas in which include these kind of unifying entities, positing certain entities that do the unifying. So that's just kind of was all in my head when you were saying that. So I don't know what you think about that, but
y'all can still hear me, right?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. Things flashing at me. I'm not entirely sure why. So yeah, there's I like the way that you're thinking about your because this the idea of unity. So I know I've kind of shifted us from a concept of simplicity to one of unity, but I think you hit the nail right on the head by hinting that they are very intimately related. Because again, this is like I mentioned before, people can certainly push back on us here and be like, well look, we just have to understand that, it's not going to be this nice and pretty unified picture that satisfies our aesthetic preference. There's just going to be disentangled forms of understanding, and that's how the world's going to be. It's a mess. It's chaotic. People obviously push back like this, and it's one of those things that you have to, you're going to have to argue for. You're going to have to insist, because it is, in a way, an a priori argument. It's in a way a type of transcendental argument, and I think you were hitting this earlier, Tim, is that we're starting with these sets of facts, these datums about the world, and we're saying, okay, what must be the case for us, for these facts to even obtain? What must be the case? This is Kant's famous transcendental idealism. He's, saying, like, look, we have knowledge of, these things. We know that things exist, and these are synthetic, a priori, claims about existence are synthetic a priori claims about the world. So we must be able to make some sort of understanding of the world using the concepts that we bring to the world. So that's the transcendental part of Kant's argument here. He says, look, we have this knowledge, and it would have to be the case that we bring concepts to even have this knowledge. We would have to have a concept of space, of time, of causation, and these concepts have to be there to even make sense of the world. And so Hegel's doing something very similar. He's saying that, look, there's these facts about the world, and if we want it all to make sense, if it's going to hang together in any rational sense, this is how it has to be.
So you would, just so I'm clear, so you would agree, would you agree with the preference for I guess these unifying entities?
Well, sure. So for me, the unifying entities are going to be concepts, on my view. So on my view, we mediate the entire world through concepts. So if we're looking for that rational whole, that's going to be reason. So reason with a capital R, so to speak, would be the thing that encompasses all of reality. It's what would allow us to access moral facts, physical facts, mathematical facts, logical facts. Reason is what all of these things have in common. And it would be the rational structure of the world that is the unifying thing. And Hegel calls this God. Hegel is often seen as a theist, but this is a very watered down theism. And it's a type of theism that makes God depend on us. So it satisfies certain theological questions as well. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar, everyone listening to this is familiar with, why did God create a world in the first place? Why did he create a world if there's just so much horrific suffering and so many bad things? Well, this Hegelian view gives us an answer to that question. It's because God's very existence, his supremeness, his divinity, depends on us. He has to have other self-consciousnesses in the world in order to just be God. If there wasn't anything else in the world, if there was no these other self-consciousnesses for God to interact with, there wouldn't be he wouldn't be God at that point. And so this gives us a pretty straightforward, satisfactory answer to that kind of question. But it does that at a cost. Is God something that is just a construct of our imagination that's then just a useful fiction? Or is something like Nietzsche right, where we've killed God? This idea that is God, that's part of reason, we've killed it. And now we have to become gods. We have to become, this, world spirit has to now become an Übermensch or an Overman, as Nietzsche says. And that this is a real problem, that, we're not ready to do this. We as humans, as a society, just are not ready for this death of God. So there's definitely very many interesting routes that this Hegelian view can take us. They can give us very interesting answers to certain theological questions, but then they raise other problems that other more traditional Christians probably are not going to find appealing or appetizing to take on.
Where I can get on board is, I understand the primacy of reason, in this situation. Of course, I feel like I can dig deeper than that. through the primacy of reason to get to something unifying of that reason. But we can explore that further maybe if we want to later. But I wanted to have Kyle jump in here and say whatever he's thinking.
Yeah, it seems like so Hegel's concept of God seems to be more like a useful fiction, like
it's more like Spinoza's. So
Okay.
one of the objections is that it's like a useful fiction. I don't agree with that. I think it's so. Hegel is very, very influenced by Spinoza. And so I think it's more of a pantheist or panentheist type view, where because this rational whole encompasses everything, it could be seen as panentheist, and that this is just the nature of the divine, and that our whole history of inquiry about religion is making progress, trying to understand the nature of this divineness.
So yeah, that actually, because I'm a panentheist myself, so I would actually be sympathetic to that kind of view where where everything's within God, right?
I'm making another Hegelian. I love it.
Yeah, but, I mean, obviously, okay, so I think this is where it becomes a little difficult, I guess. So under my position, while I am a panentheist, I would also say that God exists outside of human minds, right? So basically, God is not necessarily dependent on us, right? That God is an objective being that actually does exist out there, and that He is also supreme, meaning that He's perfect, right? Now, of course, we can ask, okay, well, why did God create an imperfect world? I mean, that's a whole other discussion about theodicies and stuff like that. But overall, I mean, I guess it gets us really close, because if you're talking about panentheism, well, I'm a panentheist, so it gets us really close to, okay, what is this God? Like, is this God just kind of like a construction of our own minds? Like, is it like a useful fiction, or maybe, something else? Or is it actually something that is perfect? And if it's perfect, well, then it's personal, and that sort of thing. So I guess, I don't know, because at this point, I mean, it's really interesting how the views are really similar in that sort of way, right? At least my own, I don't know if Tim's a panentheist, but at least speaking for myself, right, I could see how those sort of views are really close to each other, that it's really difficult to see where the disagreements are, I guess.
And so I like that, because I think that's showing that maybe we're climbing the same mountain just from different sides. And as we resolve disagreement, we'll move further up that mountain, and we'll eventually arrive at the peak where there are no more disagreements. And then we'll go, oh, here we go. Because I think this is how we're going to resolve our disagreements, is going to revolve around how we approach the question, how does our concepts of God respond to our religious concerns? And when we start hashing out all of those disagreements, I think we'd probably more or less come to something similar, at least more or less, because again, as Tim was mentioning out, we're starting with certain datums. We're starting with facts about the world, and we're trying to find a way to get all of them to unify all of them. So there's only so many ways that we can do this. We already know that what we're trying to look for is in some sense abstract. It's not, this concrete thing that everything has in common, including all other abstract things. I think there's certain ways that, necessarily because of the types of beings that we are, if we're taking this question seriously, we can't help but come to an answer that's going to seem very, very close to one another.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think, Tim? You think it seems really hard to tell the difference, Tim. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, it's Hegel has definitely given me a new perspective, a new, really just kind of landscape in the philosophy of religion to explore now, which is probably why I haven't made any progress whatsoever on my continental philosophy since taking up Hegel. But
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of one of those things like, hey, I'm here. I might as well just live it up. I've had the phenomenology of spirit on my bedside table for 2 years now, and I'll be quite honest. It was hard. I did a lot of the things wrong. A lot of the pitfalls that people fall into with Hegel, I fell right into it. If anything I've taken away from this experience is I will never overestimate the value of secondary literature ever again.
Yep.
Secondary literature is an absolute must for Hegel.
All right. Sorry. What was the question?
What do you think about the sort of similarities between like Hegel's view, which is what Ben holds to, which is very similar to panentheistic God? What do you think about that, Tim?
Oh yeah, I've always thought it was interesting, this type of thing, which is interesting because it's like for me, my main thing is I feel like being as consistent with reason as possible, that the difference here is our stopping points and where we see the foundations actually in the sense, and I just think that no, there's something deeper to be investigated here, and that's what would pull Kyle, you and I out and go, okay, well, wait, and then it's like, well, this is actually constructed, and this reality that we exist in is actually dependent from the thing in which is constructing it, but it's not so separately and far removed from it in a sense. So it's very an immanent view of foundations, which is what I think the unifying entity is. That X unifying set of facts Y. That's how I've always thought about it. I always thought it was interesting. It's like, okay, well, then there's just a little bit of things to see. Well, why do I think I can see? Why do I think that, okay, I can actually go deeper here? And people go, no, I'm perfectly fine not going down that route. This is far enough.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, because I would agree that I think that's probably where it kind of gets tricky, because it's like we're both digging down trying to find the treasure at the bottom or something like that. But at some point, some people may want to stop, be like, okay, I can't go any farther. Whereas others may want to keep going down until eventually we reach the bottom and find truth at the bottom, so. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's also important to recognize that we probably won't ever find it in the sense that we are satisfied with what we found. This is the nature of philosophy, and really kind of what makes it fun. Like, these are those questions that will keep you up at night for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
That'll always give you something to think about. Like, you'll never really be bored because you'll always be able to probe these questions deeper. And so for me, that's part of the attraction of philosophy. I'm not gonna lie.
No, right. No, exactly. I had something that I thought was good. So I guess I find that hopefully this is not too, I don't even know if we have to stick on this particular topic, but the whole idea of moving from, I guess, our principle of simplicity to, does reality, proceed from simplicity? I guess would be an interesting thing to talk about. I don't know, Ben. Would you agree or disagree with that, or what do you think?
So yeah, but now it's important to keep in mind that what we've been using here are transcendental arguments. So this sort of objection is not an objection that would really apply to that, because it would our transcendental argument is saying that the metaphysics of reality there's a continuum. It'll match up with the rationality of our mind. And so this objection is, well, maybe the world just isn't like that. And so what does that kind of objection look like? Is there some kind of reality, some part of reality that makes us doubt whether the rationality of our mind really does map up to the metaphysics of reality? And quantum mechanics has certainly thrown a monkey wrench in everything, it seems. So I don't know. That's certainly one of the questions that I'm still wrestling with, and I think it's a very important one that you've hit on here. And so I think the most important takeaway is that the Hegelian that what we're putting forward, this PSU, or this idea, this holistic unity thing, is a type of transcendental argument. So we're doing this a priori. We're saying that these are the conditions that need to be required to make sense of a datum. But now if some other datum comes up that contradicts something within that, then we're going to have to reevaluate. And that's where we're at with quantum mechanics, I think. I think quantum mechanics really, until we've got the full grasp of it, which we may never have, I think that's a thorn in the side of the Hegelian view, that this idea that rationality can go all the way down to the smallest scales and to the very big in cosmic scales. Maybe that type of rationality that we have and are capable of is only local.
Okay, so that's interesting, because it makes me think of a Kuhnsian line of reasoning where Kuhns gave a presentation on how when he says in one of his lectures that when you look at quantum mechanics without sort of something like Aristotelian presuppositions, things will always be weird. But and spooky and things of that sort. But when you look at it through lens and presuppositions of something Aristotelian, things start to line up and make sense. And so in that way, I was going to ask, when you say, rational, well, in what? Because we have rational frameworks. So I guess are we working from which framework would because in his view, he would be saying, well, there is rationality all the way down to there. It's just you're operating on the wrong presuppositions. So I don't know. What would you think about that?
So yeah, and perhaps that's the right solution to this. In that the paradigm in which we are operating in is constructed by all the previous paradigms and paradigm shifts, and so what we have is this, paradigm that if we don't move away from, things just aren't going to make sense within it. That's certainly one way of approaching it, but it might also be the case that we can't make sense of quantum mechanics. It might be the case that whatever the right answer for quantum mechanics is just not understandable to our minds because of the types of beings we are.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's a possibility. Do I lean that direction? No, not so much. But then again, that might just be, that's an assumption I'm making. I'm bringing that on and saying no, look, it is rational all the way down. We are part of the world. We are products of the world. And in some way that should make the world intelligible to us.
Okay, so what you're saying is you're kind of saying, well, there would be this epistemic limitation, that human mind would have an epistemic limitation, but it's not rational all the way down, but rather there's going to be at some point we're going to bump up against our own epistemic limitations.
Yeah, and we may never know so. This is what Kant's famous wall that he hits in the things in themselves, or the noumena. We can't say anything about these things in themselves. There's just, our concepts and the appearance of things, and we're constructing a world of appearances. But things in themselves, we can't really know them. So Hegel is worried about this. He sees that as a really big problem. And so he's going to say, no, we can know the world in itself because the rationality of our mind maps up with the metaphysics of the world, such that we can know the world in and for itself. And so it does away with these things in itself. Well, maybe quantum mechanics has brought these things in themselves back to us now. Maybe there's these, the position and the velocity of particles are just things that we can, if we rationally understand one, we can't know the other. Maybe that's just, a fundamental challenge to this view. I'm still working with it.
Okay, yeah. No, it's just interesting because it makes me think of where Kyle and I sit when it comes to a theistic idealism, because we would say, well, there's always an objective knower kind of going on, in any that would always be intelligible by any quantum system, because it's always like it's interesting because we would agree, like it's all mind, like it's never divorced of mind. It's just we would be different alters of that in a sense. And so in a sense of that thinking, I'm like, okay, I can kind of sit in an interesting, all right, a more comfortable spot. Kyle, are you
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, you can go, Ben. Sorry.
It should be. I like what you said. It's at no point is it divorced from mind, and so that's something we're going to have in common here. In this now, not in a fundamental idealist sound like in a Berkeley sense, but in the sense of when we have a thought, a true thought, it's an objective thought, meaning that the truth of that thought doesn't depend on anything about us. So this view is often called absolute idealism or objective idealism.
Mm-hmm.
And so idealism is a bit misleading because it should be ideaism. And what it is it's saying that our ideas are not only part of our mind, but are also part of the rational structure of the world. And it's because the world has this rational structure. That's how we come to know it. Our mind is seeking it out, and it can find it.
Yeah, I really love that way you described just now. Yeah. I mean, that would pretty much be my position. So
awesome. I feel like I'm the Hegelian gospel here, I guess we can call it.
Yeah.
But I think we might be climbing the same mountain from different sides here, because this view, while it might sound strange at first blush, solves a lot of problems. It solves a lot of epistemic problems. It solves a lot of worry, and it allows us to make progress. It allows us to see problems in ways that make progress.
I was gonna say, like, it's interesting. I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because it's like I look at I guess there was a big uproar thanks to Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules, on his debunking of the applicability of mathematics thing, where I saw this idea. It's like, no, like this mathematics cannot be necessary truths. Like they're like I saw this whole idea, like that is something that we should just not embrace. And I always found it interesting that, like, even as an atheist, I'm like, but that sounds like a superior view, that they should be necessary truths. You know what I'm talking about? Like they're like, no, this is just all of this are human, are conceived by humans. There's nothing about the world in which it is. I'm talking about, like, it seems like you would more agree with me than you would with them. Not about the argument itself.
There's two competing camps here too. There's the Platonists and the Nominalists. There's the people that think that things like mathematics are invented, and then there's the Platonists who think that mathematics are things that are discovered. And so, me being the contrarian philosopher that I am, I take a hybrid view. I don't end up in either camp. So I think that those questions are actually just too confused to even be worth answering. I think that when we talk about abstract truths, we're not talking about how those truths correspond to some ontologically weighty part of reality. So it's facts about the property of primeness don't obtain because of these weird things in the world called being prime. I think these are just abstract truths that are true in and of themselves. So they're necessary truths. They can't have any other value other than true. To conceive of them as being false is to just not understand them as concepts. And so that's certainly a way in which I'm going to avoid that nominalist camp, that idea that the applicability of mathematics is something that we read into the world. No, I think mathematics is something, it's a fundamental aspect of the world. It's a tool that we can use to understand the world in and of itself. When Einstein writes his famous equation, E equals mc squared, that equation is describing something about reality. That is a mathematical structure that underlies the world. I'm very much in that camp.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I always saw it as, that we use things like the symbols or the these abstract things as to communicate how the world really actually is. And so, but the world is going to have a particular structure for us to communicate the mathematical part of it, and that's kind of where my mind goes with it. So, yeah, we're being that same agreement there.
So, and that's a really great point. Again, I'm loving all these segues. You keep softballing me. Is you talk about symbols. Symbols which we can say make words make language, and our language makes concepts, and our concepts help us understand reality. So I think these are just assumptions that everyone just takes for granted, that we build concepts from words that are just little noises that we chirp and write down. And then those concepts help us understand a world in and for itself. And I think really the only way to make sense of this is if there is a continuum between those little chirps that we make through concept or through our language that build our concepts and then align with the world. You don't, if that's broken, then then the very notion of us having these words and building these concepts, we're left with all kinds of epistemic worries about how can we know anything? How are we coming into contact with reality? Right.
And so could we say that the reason why, we could come up with, I guess, infinitely more wrong mathematical conclusions or wrong answers and things is because we at that point we are bumping up to our epistemic limitations in the sense, or is that confusing? Fallibility, you know what I'm talking about?
So I would approach this using modal semantics again. I would just say that the landscape of possible worlds is just much, much larger than the landscape of actual worlds. There's just one actual world.
Right.
And then the possible worlds that we can conceive from that just far, 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 far outweigh that. And I think that it's this idea of possibility and necessity that gives us our forms of freedom. So being able to divorce ourselves from the actual phenomenology of the world at any moment and think about the world in an abstract way, a possible world, a way the world might be, and then try to act to make that possibility obtain. I think that's a form of freedom. I think that's a uniquely rational ability that humans have, and that helps us understand how we can make we're free in the way no bird is free in the way we are free, because they can't do what I just said.
Right. So, what would your theory of modality or view of modality be then?
So I don't know if I have a particular theory of modality. I find David Lewis's modal realism to be quirky and fun, but I have no idea if it's true or not. So basically, the book that I pored over for probably the better part of a year is called Naming and Necessity by Saul Kripke. And it's just a hugely, hugely influential book in the analytic philosophy world. And it's basically pure metaphysics. And what he goes through and helps us understand the metaphysics of modality, but in a way that probably wouldn't be able to satisfactorily answer the question you just asked now, because it's not so much a general theory as it is disentangled forms of understanding and ways of thinking about necessity and possibility in robust ways. And certainly a lot of works come out of that. Peter Van Inwagen has what's called mitigated modal skepticism, has certainly come. And so that's certainly a skeptical way of thinking about our modal intuitions. And so that would certainly be a theory of modality that's incompatible with the modal realism that I just mentioned earlier. So I certainly couldn't be both. I guess I still have to think about it more. I'm pretty early in my journey through the metaphysics of modality. I've pretty much only got the Kripkean work under my belt.
Gotcha. No, it's awesome. Kyle, were you about to say something?
No, yeah. Honestly, like modality is a whole like complex topic. I'll probably just accept Robert Koons's view, which is actually the same as I know Graham Moppy. He holds the same view, and I would hold to that view modality.
See, I need to do more research there. I don't even know what Koons.
But it's so much here. That's the fun part, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. I've got so much more to read.
Yeah.
Wow, we really agreed a lot in this. I was not expecting that.
Awesome. That means we're doing philosophy.
Yeah.
Resolving disagreements. I like it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, we're going to end the stream now, but thanks, Ben, for coming on. It was a really helpful discussion. I guess our really only disagreement would be how far we want to go down, right? And I guess you were right in that sense. We're kind of climbing the same mountain of truth, right? We may not fully get to the very top, but at least we'll get close enough where
we still just have a few more disagreements to resolve, and then we'll be
there. So all right. Thanks guys for coming on, and have a nice day.
Thanks for having me.